This next section is going to be dealing with listing inventory management. And what this has to do with is being able to take in listings and properly manage those listings. There are state and federal laws concerning cold calling. Obviously, listings are the foundation of our business. And one of the primary sources of listings are for sale by owners and expired listings. We have to be careful about these do not call lists, and there's two. There's a federal do not call list and there's a state do not call list. Florida's Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services say that we are prohibited from calling people that are on this list unless we've done business with them over the last 18 months. Now there's an exclusion. The state also says that if somebody is a for sale by owner and they're giving out their telephone number for people to call them to inquire about their property, then they cannot hide behind the protection of the do not call list. Now, this is Florida only. On the federal do not call list, they don't have that rule. So if a person is on the federal do not call list, that's the one that I would look at. I would stay away from that one. There are a number of ways that we can obtain good listings. A farm area is a great way of doing it. Let me tell you what a farm area is. That's an area of the community that you've chosen and said, you know what, I'd like to make this mine. I would like to go in and get to know the people. And that when they have a real estate need, they're going to come to me. Probably the best place to start your farm area is in the neighborhood that you live. Obviously, you know a lot of the neighbors. Let them know that you're in the business. Stop around on a regular basis, give out cards, give out information. Let them know that you're there. Don't be pushy, but at the very same time, let them know that you're professional and that you're there to serve. Another great source for listings is the expired listings. Expired listings are simply sellers that had their properties listed. They didn't sell, and the number one reason that they didn't sell is because they were overpriced. And so you're going to have a challenge when you visit an expired listing to bring them from an unreal place into the real world. I wrote a course recently. The course is entitled Listing to Sell, Moving Sellers from Oz Back to Kansas. Because a lot of times what we're dealing with are those sellers that are living in Oz, thinking their property's worth this, way up here, when the fact of the matter is the buying public's saying it's only worth this. That's going to be your challenge. Another source of great listings are for sale by owners. They've got signs up, they want to sell their property. The question is, are they real sellers? Are they motivated? And sometimes for sale by owners are not necessarily motivated. Sometimes they're just trying to find out what the market's willing to pay. But I think that if you contact for sale by owners, you've got to find out if they're motivated or not. You've got to sit down with them and go over the process of what it takes. First of all, if they're going to sell the property themselves, that's quite a task. And you need to explain the ups and the downs about that. At the very same time, those things that you can do that they can't do. You know, there's a psychology when we're dealing with selling real estate that a lot of your sellers don't understand. I think that what you have to make sure they understand that buyers cannot take physical possession of a home until they take psychological possession. If that seller is in that house, that buyer is blocked from taking psychological possession. So it's important for sellers to understand that they're their worst enemy when trying to sell the property themselves. Besides for sale by owners, I've got to tell you there's a number of other ways. I've always thought that open houses were a great way to find listings, and I'll tell you why. 45% of all the people that visit open houses purchase within 2 years. 80% of the people who visit open houses have to sell their home first. So the first question that I would always have to somebody visiting an open house, do you currently have a home that you've got to sell before you can purchase? I guarantee you in most cases they're going to say yes. So instead of putting your selling cap on, put your listing cap on for your open houses. The listing appointment, there are different ways of doing the listing appointment. Some people like the 1-2 punch. I like the one shot, get me in, get me out, and I'm going to get the listing. And just make sure that when you go into the listing appointment that you have everything that you need. You've got your CMA done, you've got your seller net sheet done, you've got everything that you need when you walk in there to walk away with that listing. One of the big issues, one of the big things that you're going to have to do when you go on a listing appointment is to make sure that you do a CMA, a competitive or comparative market analysis. You want to be able to sit down with that seller and say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, these are the properties that have recently sold that are similar to your house. These are properties that are currently on the market. This will be our competition, and we don't want to be above our competition. And by the way, here are the properties that expired, and the reason they expired is because they were overpriced. We don't want to be there. So that CMA is going to be critical when we're doing all of this evaluation. And when you finish the CMA, remember you're going to have a price range, a low range and a high range. And what you've got to tell them is their property is going to sell somewhere in between. So now when you do the seller net sheet, I do a seller net sheet based on the low range and on the high range. Then when you get an offer that comes in, you do another seller net sheet, and you come back and you compare the net sheets, and then you get into the text of the contract. The last stage of your CMA, remember, is going to be reconciliation, where you're reconciling all of those various approaches. The seller's net sheet on page 3-13 and 14, you might want to take a look at that because you're going to have a calculation. You're going to have to deal with your seller net sheet. Some of the big calculations that you're going to have to know how to do is your documentary stamps on the deed. Remember that the documentary stamp on the deed is 70 cents for every unit of $100 of the purchase price. That's an expense by the seller. There also may be some real estate taxes that have to be prorated. Remember, real estate taxes are paid in arrears. That means the buyer probably is going to have to pay the entire tax tab. The seller's got to throw in his share at closing. So there's going to be some prorations and some other things to calculate your seller net sheet. Now that we've had our presentation, let's talk about the listing contract itself. Remember that in the listing contract, once you have the seller sign the listing and you sign the listing and it's fully executed, remember the seller has to have a copy of that delivered back to them within 24 hours of its execution. Now there are three types of listing contracts that we deal with. The open listing, remember, the open listing is where the seller says, I'm going to list it with you, but I also reserve the right to list it with other brokers, and I reserve the right to sell it myself. And hey, here's the deal. Whoever sells it gets paid. So that's the one that we like the least. The exclusive right of sale listing contract is the one that we want. It says that we're going to get the listing, and no matter who sells it during the listing period, we're going to get paid regardless. And when we're talking about negotiating the list price, it's imperative. Once again, let's go back to the CMA. You've got to negotiate it and be willing to be flexible, because you know the fact of the matter is, this is what we believe it's going to sell for. Might it sell for a little bit more? Maybe. Might it sell for a little bit less? Maybe. We won't know that until we put it on the market. So if a seller insists on a little bit higher price, work with them just a little bit. What I suggest is don't be any more than about 15% above your high point CMA mark. And what you could basically say is that I'll be willing to give you this little higher price, but you've got to be willing to give me back a built-in reduction if we don't get any activity. And folks, that's got to be critical. They've got to be willing to give back as well. If you're going to give something, they've got to give something as well. In terms of negotiating your commission, just remember that every time that you're on a listing appointment that you're going to be negotiating your commission. Don't be afraid to negotiate everything that you can. What I've got to tell you is, what do you think you're worth? What's the old saying? I bargained with life for a penny and life paid me no more. You've got to decide for yourself what you think you're worth, and you got to fight for it. Just like you're going to fight for the sale of their property. You got to show them that you're worth what you're being paid. And with that, I think that's all we have in the listing inventory management section. What I'd like to do right now is I'd like to get in and do a review with you to make sure we understand those areas of critical concern. The Federal Do Not Call list prohibits licensees from calling unless they've conducted business over the last 90 days. The Florida Do Not Call list does not protect for sale by owners from being contacted by licensees. Most agents will create a farm area in the neighborhood in which they live. The major reason a property's listing expires is because it's overpriced. The CMA is comprised of properties that have recently sold, properties that are currently on the market, and properties that have recently expired. Reconciliation is a weighted averaging of the data of the CMA. Remember Robin Hood when you're adjusting your comparables. Take from the rich and give to the poor. If the comparable is a better property, you want to take away from it to make it like the subject. If the comparable is an inferior property, you want to add to it to make it like the subject. The seller's net sheet takes the sales price minus all the outstanding mortgages and other closing costs. Copies of the listing contract has to be delivered to the seller within 24 hours of its execution. The open listing, only the broker gets paid who secures the buyer. In the exclusive listing, the seller reserves the right to sell it themselves without owing a commission. The exclusive right of sale listing contract is the one where the broker is going to get paid no matter who sells the property. A net listing guarantees the seller a certain net amount at closing. And that's all we have for that section of this chapter.